Good morning, and today we're going to talk a little bit about an introduction to the Renaissance and Reformation. In other words, we're going to be taking a look at around 1300 to 1600 AD, and we're going to focus our aspects on Europe. So first we'll describe what the word Renaissance means. Renaissance means a rebirth. It was a period of new thinking and a re-examination of the old classics and a revival of arts and learning. So it started in Italy for three reasons. First, Italy had these thriving towns that were becoming even bigger cities. As the cities were growing with their trade, you start noticing a wealthy merchant class. Instead of the very rich and the very poor, a middle merchant class started to form. We also have their classical heritage of Greece and Rome. So they already have these built buildings, they already have these built and established trade routes coming through. And so it seems likely that was probably why the Renaissance starts off in Italy. But now that it has started there, there's other events that will then spur the Renaissance, not only throughout Italy, but into Europe as well. First of all is the spreading of new ideas through Gutenberg's printing press. So if there's printed materials that are being put into the hands of the common man for the first time, the common man is going to want to know what's in them. They're going to start getting this rudimentary education of wanting to learn to read. And so, of course, information is also being disseminated throughout the common lands. There's also new sailing technology, as we see from 1300 to 1600 AD. We're going further and further with trade routes, specifically on the hands of ships. We also see a waning church power, whereas the church in the early parts, the Dark Ages, had almost total authority, and there was just these little fiefdoms and little kingdoms that kind of swore allegiance to or against the church. Now we're starting to see reformations happening in the church, and the church is beginning to lose its power. As they're beginning to lose their power, and as we start seeing more an education, or at least learning of reading in the common man, there are more questioning minds. People are starting to wonder, can I care for myself and my family? Do I really need to have the church behind me at all times? Do I really need to have a king or a prince behind me at all times? And then, of course, the spirit of exploration related to Marco Polo's published accounting of his journey to and from China is going to harken back to the ideas of an empire that was growing once from Italy, from the Roman times. And so others are going to want to explore and expand out as well. There's also this new focus on what is called humanism, where people begin to turn away from the dominant ideals put forth by the church. Now, religion is going to remain their greatest influence, but humanism is going to bring more of a recognition of human potential and scientific inquiry. There still is this sense that everything has come from God, that God is creator of all, but now what the human can do with the possibilities of themselves and scientific inquiry is starting to become more important. And so when we take a look at this time period of the Renaissance, we see there's less of a focus on God and more of a focus on man. As you'll notice, neither has disappeared, but man is becoming more prominent and God is becoming less so. At the same time, we also have a lot of people writing down ideas, and they're being disseminated through Gutenberg's press. First of all, we are starting to leave behind religious ideals. Not everything now being written is no longer about Christian heroes or to live a pious life. You might find some more secular pieces of writing being happening at this time. You're also going to see a breaking from a tradition and presenting a more realistic versions of life. Whereas before, everyone was looking at how you can be more pious, or you're having this sense of heroes that you're putting up on a pedestal. Now we're getting a little bit more of realism. You're going to start seeing journals becoming more popular. You're going to start seeing nonfiction texts being written from explorers' point of views and more people wanting to read them. Common people can now enjoy tales as well. As you're starting to see the start of a very rudimentary education, the common people now can start enjoying writers. And at the very end of the Renaissance, you're going to see people like William Shakespeare who are going to write about daily life and average people in order to entertain the average people living their daily lives. Another one of our writers that we're going to see, moving back to Italy, would be Machiavelli. One of his greatest works is called The Prince, and it's a bit of a political philosophy. One of the ideas that Machiavelli comes up with is that it's okay to commit evil as long as it's for the greater good. And so that's where we get our term to be Machiavellian. To be Machiavellian means willing to commit an evil for a personal gain. So for the idea of wanting to do greater good and expecting nothing in return, Machiavelli says at times people are going to do something for their own personal gain. What's in it for me? And that'd be considered very Machiavellian. Along with writers, we also see a huge expansion in the Renaissance when it comes to arts. And like writing, the artists are also going to break from traditions. Now art is focusing a lot more on perspective and techniques, using lights and shades and colors. So we're going to be seeing a hint more towards realism. It's not the time period where realism comes into its foray, but you're going to begin to see human figures instead of religious figures. You're going to start seeing more common figures, at least in the background, but then becoming more into the front and foreground. You're going to start seeing portraits of the merchant class being created, and they're going to have these techniques using the differences between light and shade, more like the more contemporary and modern art that we know. And so when we take a look at some of the people that we're looking at, particularly from the great Renaissance workers, you start seeing a bit more of perspective here. So if you take a look at the perspective we have here, everything is in a two-dimensional picture, but it looks like that far out in the background in the center, you can see the open sea with the ships. And then you see smaller buildings farther away, and then your buildings forward are very close up. Of course, one of the most famous from the Renaissance period from Italy would be Leonardo da Vinci. Now, Leonardo da Vinci studied the human anatomy. Matter of fact, he even dissected dead people in order to study bones and other parts of the body, not only for scientific observation, but he also used those ideals when it came to, say, perhaps painting the Mona Lisa that you have in the upper right corner, where he's going to use not only the effects of the artistry of shade and perspective and light, but also the sense of more realism when it comes to painting portraits. He was also interested in the mechanics of the time, and he drew plans for an airplane, a helicopter, and even a parachute, things that did not exist in Leonardo da Vinci's time, but he could imagine that these things were coming along the way, and so he's got rudimentary plans for such mechanical instruments. And so when we take a look at some of Da Vinci's work, again, he would study dead bodies, he would actually dissect them to learn more about the anatomy of the human body. And again, as I said, he also studied mechanics, so you would see things such as an airplane mechanic being drawn by Da Vinci. And then, of course, the architect of them all, the human body itself. And we believe that perhaps he drew this very famous portrait of the human being not only to give us the sense of mechanics of humanity, but also remember, as an artist, he was studying the human body in order to create better portraits and better art of man. And so when we look at some of the pictures, some of the portraits that were being made, not only are people more realistic, but you're also going to notice that it's just not going to be portraits of the Mona Lisa and other merchant or upper classes. You're also going to start seeing the common man being presented in our artwork as well. Along in the Renaissance with the arts and the writers, you're also going to see a huge boom in science. And we're going to start defining that through natural law. Well, what is natural law? Something that is natural is inherent. It should have a basis in nature. There's a sense of reality and truth in natural law. It's not made or caused by humankind. It just exists in nature. And of course, a law is an existing condition which is binding and immutable. In a law, nothing should be changed. And then, of course, as we're thinking of science and mechanics and arts and writers, we have to think mostly what this period is defined by, and that is exploration. So if we look at a map of the time, even though it is not particularly what we know of the Earth as today, the map is recognizable. You can actually take a look at the maps and see our continents. So when we talk about exploration, there is this new spirit that arises in the Renaissance of wanting to get out and explore the rest of the planet. Now, navigators, of course, had an economic reason for this. They wanted new routes to promising lands. Say, for example, when we started going off to China and coming back across land, explorers wanted to know if it was going to be easier by ship to make it to China or to make it across to the Far East in order to make it economically more feasible. So, for example, we have the story of Christopher Columbus, who went looking for a way to China to procure for Spain the riches that are described by Marco Polo's first exploration to China. Now, when we move more into England and away from Europe, we're looking at the Elizabethan age, which is near the end of the Renaissance in Europe. That's around the mid-1500s. And the Elizabethan age is the time of the Renaissance where man and women were going to be a bit more well-rounded. You're going to start seeing the mechanics of the day becoming better fashioned. Gutenberg has now made its way with a lot of different types of writings into England, so common man is getting a rudimentary education. They might be able to spell their names out. There might be people who do have a rudimentary idea of math and reading. So you're going to see the common Renaissance man and woman are going to be well-rounded. They're going to love the art and the classics of Europe. They're going to be able to do so much more than just merely exist. So what is the legacy of the Renaissance in Europe? Well, starting to look at the arts, we start looking at a portrayal of individuals and nature that is more realistic in the visual arts. We're also going to see new techniques and styles where we're looking at the ideals of perspective and colors and lights and shade that had not been used before this time. There's more attention to secular things in addition to the religious. Yes, there are still going to be, even from your greatest works of arts, like say DaVinci or Leonardo, they're certainly going to continue creating religious artwork, but they're also going to give you some secular famous art as well. When you talk about the writers in the arts, the use of vernacular languages in writing is going to become more inherent. Shakespeare himself would have been writing in English and not in Latin, as if he was from a different time period. Most everyone would have been writing in the Latin verse. And you're recognizing individual achievements, where now somebody like a Leonardo da Vinci can be recognized for their achievements instead of giving that achievement to a particular kingdom or a king, or the church itself has ordered artists or writers to create something. Now we can say William Shakespeare is a renowned playwright and poet. There's also certain knowledges that will now be available to everyone. People are starting to want to know more about the rest of the world. Exploration is becoming super evident. People are even starting to get on ships and go off and colonize. You're now getting goods and products that are coming from around the world into Europe that people are now finding affordable. These new maps and discoveries are being published. New laws are being published about natural law. So we start questioning more about humanity and humanism and what more the human could achieve. And because of that, you're also going to see societal, religious, and political reforms happening. The church, even by 1600, is still going to be strong and evident. The idea of kingdoms and fiefdoms are still going to be evidence. But by 1600, society has changed. You're going to see less of a focus on God and more of a focus on man. You're going to see less of a focus on the king having autonomy to having some political reforms and people, the common man, starting to get their rights. So mostly what happens in the Renaissance is people are questioning, who are we? What can we do with our lives? How far can man go? Now, around this time period of the Renaissance, there's also the Reformation. Now, at the time about 1300 to 1600, in Europe, almost everywhere in Europe, the Catholic Church was in power. And people began to question the corruption that they thought was pretty evident. Now, one of the major parts of the Reformation is led by a German by the name of Martin Luther, who goes ahead and writes down 93 different sets of corruption and faults that he finds with the Catholic Church, and he nails the 93 theses up on the front of his church. Now, he's not the only one to cause the religious Reformation. First of all, with the idea of our arts and humanities kind of turning out the sense of reality and common man wanting to know more, you're going to see society changing. With humanism and secularism, ideas are easily being spread with the printing press. People are becoming more educated and they're less reliant on the church. There's also going to be a political reformation at the time. Monarchs and other leaders are going to start challenging the authority of the Pope. Now, you can talk about a character like Henry VIII, the King of England, who decided to completely break away from the Catholic Church and decided to become leader of his own church. But there are other leaders that will challenge the different parts of the authority of the Pope. Now, economic-wise, the Catholic Church had a lot of money that was wanted by others, and merchants didn't want to have to pay their taxes to a church that maybe perhaps they were not a part of. And so instead of trying to pay the tithe to the Catholic Church, lots of kings or other people in charge would say, pay that to me because I'm more local, I'm the one who is defending you. And of course, merchants want to turn around and put that money back into their economy. None of them wanted to pay taxes to the Catholic Church anymore. And of course, the great idea of what a Reformation is the church had become corrupt. People were buying their ways into becoming cardinals and even corruptly buying their ways into becoming the Pope or head of the church and leaving different parts of their Catholicism leadership with sons, with others that were in favor with them. The church had become corrupt enough that they needed a Reformation. So with Luther challenging with his theses, which was basically against the sale of indulgences that the corrupt church had at the time, one of the things that he brings up is that he believed in salvation by faith alone. He started suggesting that we as humans could be in salvation by our own faith, that we didn't need the church to go to bat for us, that the church doesn't have to talk to God for us, that maybe as ourselves, we the common man, could be saved with our own faith. When people started to look in the Bible itself for these challenges, the truth they believed was in the Bible and not in traditions. So again, as they're looking for their salvation and turn to the Bible now that they're beginning to be able to read it, they started realizing that their own faith in the Bible and what the Bible was telling them was a little more towards faith in themselves and not reliance upon a Catholic Church. And finally, with Gutenberg's press coming through and with the establishment of the Bible throughout Europe by 1600, the common man can begin to interpret the Bible on their own. So, of course, there has to be a response from the church. First thing, Martin Luther was excommunicated from the church. They also did the Edict of Worms, where Luther is now called a heretic. All of the books that he would have been part to would be burned. It is illegal to help him. And, of course, he had lots of supporters and lots of help. So people who were part of Luther broke away from the church and they started a new faith. And this particular faith today is known as the Lutherans. You also have the peasant revolt at the time of Reformation, where the peasants are revolting, they're not supported by Luther and his adherents, and they start another religion of their own. And that is the Protestant revolt. Now, the Protestant revolt is going to be led by smaller kingdoms, usually led by smaller royalty or princes who basically want to take religion over as their own, whether it's from economic reasons or just pure power, but that is where Protestantism has its foundations. We also have the Peace of Augsburg, in which King Charles V decreed that each prince could decide on the faith of their state. And so whether or not they wanted to be led by Lutheranism or Protestantism, or if they still wanted to stay with the Catholic Church, King Charles V said, "You guys are in charge of your own localities. You decide upon your faith." When Henry VIII comes along in England, the Catholic Church lost more power when he becomes King of England, and he had no male heir to the throne. Since he was not allowed to divorce, he asked the Pope he would like to divorce from his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, and to remarry. Because he was not allowed to do so, he decided to break away from the church, become the head of the English church, becoming a Protestant, and then he started beheading the people who opposed him, including his wives, and he would excommunicate a lot of Catholic leadership because he was starting his own church. So, of course, at this point in time in the 1500s, England is now in religious turmoil. Most of England is still Catholic, but the king turned it Protestant. His son, who was supposed to take over, of course, was brought up in the Protestant faith as well, but his son does not live out of becoming a teenager, so his oldest daughter, Mary, becomes queen. Queen Mary was brought up as a Catholic, and so she decides to bring England back into Catholicism. Now, she herself does not live long, and so his second child, or his third in a row, Elizabeth, would then take them back into Protestantism. She didn't really care for either side of the church, but she figured this is what father wanted, and so by this point in time, Protestantism is going to be cemented in England with Queen Elizabeth I. With Queen Elizabeth I, she had Parliament establish the Anglican Church as the only legal church in England. So both moderate Catholics and more moderate Protestants soon accepted that the Anglican Church was it. Priests could marry if they came into the Anglican Church, and they revised services so they'd be more acceptable to all. So the Catholics and the Protestants that came together established a single English Anglican Church. Of course, there are still going to be some who still do not like that idea. And so when Queen Elizabeth I was ruler, as establishment of being Protestant but moderate in her Anglican Church, we have certain people who are going to press for further reform. And that is going to start off with Calvin. Calvin says that all man is sinful by nature and you cannot earn salvation on your own. That God is going to choose who is saved. It is predetermined even before you're born. And Calvin's also going to support a theocratic government, that the church should be in control of everything, that the church should be the one ruling the land. Hence, we now have the idea of Reformation called Calvinism. There will be more religions formed after this. Now, again, this is all coming from the Protestant church that was supposed to form as the Anglican Church with the Catholics in England. So not only do you have the Calvinists breaking off, but you also have the Presbyterians and the Anabaptists. Now, the Anabaptists are completely opposite from Calvinists. They say the church and the state are completely separate. That you will be rebaptized as an adult. Now that you are an adult, you should now have this choice of whether or not you want to become a part of the church or not. And so if you still believe that you want to have faith, you are rebaptized as an adult. Anabaptists are also against war, and they're also against the idea of shared possessions. Again, the idea of being an Anabaptist is quite individualized. You're not going to think that a government should get together and fight a war. You're not going to have this idea of socialism or communism where everybody should be sharing possessions. But of course, there are still going to be some Catholic diehards in England who remained loyal to the Pope. They're going to form a new order called the Society of Jesus, today known as the Jesuits. Now, they reformed the Catholic Church rather than leaving it, and so you see this Catholic Reformation, otherwise known by the Catholic Church as the Counter-Reformation. Some things that came through this Counter-Reformation include new schools in classical studies and technology. They also are going to try to convert non-Christians through Catholicism, By using missionary services, now with our exploration happening, a lot of these Jesuits are going to go across the planet and try and convert non-Christians to Catholicism. They're also, in this same missionary stance, going to try to stop the spread of Protestantism. The Pope's going to have reforms themselves. They're going to investigate the sales of indulgences and other abuses, most of these of which was happening with the popes that had happened right before them. They're also going to approve of the Jesuit order. After all, one of the things that the missionaries said they were going to do is not only convert non-Christians, but also stop the spread of Protestantism, which is going to make the Catholic Church stronger. They're also going to do an inquisition that's going to seek out heresy within their church. And lastly, you're going to have the Council of Trent that starts setting down into our more modern day and language what the Catholic Church's aims and goals are from here on out. Now, the Council of Trent, one of the things that they had decided is that the Church has the final authority to interpret the Bible. After seeing all of these breaks from the Catholic Church and even the further breaks of Protestantism that happens in one country, in England alone, they needed to put down into paper what their authorities were. And their first authority said that the Church has the final authority to interpret the Bible. That people need to have faith and good works in order to be considered themselves as Catholic. Not only do you have to have the faith in the Bible and the faith in the leadership of the Church, but you should also be going out and doing good works according to their particular Catholicism. That both the Bible and tradition should be considered equal. Lastly, that the proper sale of indulgences is one of the good works of charity. So there is still sales of indulgences that a lot of people would have found corrupt, but now they're saying that the sale of indulgences could be considered an act of charity. Now, throughout the legacy of Reformation, you're going to see new denominations being developed. The Catholic Church has now been reformed, and so you're going to be seeing still more breakoffs because some people are not going to agree with some of the ideas of the Council of Trent. And of course, as we're working with missionary services and getting people across the world to come into the Catholic Church, you're going to see more of a push of education that is used to promote the beliefs of the Catholic Church. At this time, women are not going to gain any roles in the church. The church is specifically going to be driven by males. Monarchs and states are going to see increased power, however, as the church begins to decline. The Catholic Church is never going to recoup its power it once had before the Reformation. It is also, however, going to lay the groundwork for the Enlightenment that not only comes across Europe, but even into its colonies, where it might not be perhaps the spread of Catholicism, but the spread of the idea of God having this renewed sense of value to humans. And that is where the Enlightenment begins, around the 1700s and the early 1800s. Well, that is it for the Renaissance and the Reformation for Europe around 1300 to 1600 AD. If you'd like to learn more about that time period, put a comment down below on what else we might want to discuss. If you'd like to learn specifically about other nations in Europe and their Reformation or their Renaissance, also leave a comment below and I can get back at you with another video that is more specific to that particular part of Europe. And as always, thanks for stopping by.